While summer vacation continues for many parents and kids, the question on their minds is, when will the school bell ring? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The COVID-19 pandemic robbed students of their year, forcing them to try and continue learning online from home. Now, this September, Ontario is pushing a hybrid model of in-class and online learning, although there are no clear directions, so a lot's been left to the school boards to decide. It'll be a whole new world when students do sit down at their desks. There will be challenges for teachers as well. Parents are in limbo as the hybrid model of in-class and online learning will make childcare a nightmare. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at how students will return to school safely. Now, Ontario Education Minister Stephen Lecce was invited on, but was unable to make the time. Education opposition critic Marit Stiles will join us later, as well as Carol Campbell, Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T. First, let's get a view of the big picture and what's it's going to take to return to class. Jerome Cranston's the Dean of Faculty of Education at the University of Regina, and he joins us now. And Jerome, you've been hosting webinars for teachers navigating the pandemic. What are they telling you?
We hosted a webinar over 12 weeks and heard from educators, mostly from across the prairies. They are both looking forward to getting back to classes, yet are doing so with tremendous apprehension and anxiety. They want to be in classes with kids. It's what they enjoy most in terms of their profession, yet they are concerned for the well-being of their students, for themselves and their families.
Now, the deans of education you've been speaking with as well as you being a dean of education at the University of Regina, what concerns of, in the bigger picture for the deans of education?
I think one of the things that we've talked about, the 50 plus deans of education who meet regularly is, on one hand, Canada, is a federation of provinces and we have tremendous diversity in a lot of fronts. I think that the concern is, though, that the diversity is also lending itself to the fact that every jurisdiction at provincial level, and even in some cases local authorities, are doing their very best to come up with models, hybrid models, Copernican system, quarter systems, block schedules. Yet there doesn't seem to be any coherence or necessary research base for which of these systems might work best.
Now, you'd like to see a pan-Canadian approach. Why is that?
I think Dr. Theresa Tam has provided a lot of leadership, which has then informed provincial health authorities on how to move forward specific to their provinces. I think similarly, we could pull together a group at a pan-Canadian level, not to dictate all of the conditions, but to provide a sense of leadership. We have a Council of Ministers of Education in Canada who actually have a mandate of pan-Canadian leadership in education. The Canadian Teachers Federation, in many cases, represent the various provincial and territorial teacher associations. The Canadian Education Association represents parents and school boards. And then we have our group, the Association of Canadian Deans of Education. I think bringing those groups together with some of the national leaders in terms of epidemiology and infectious health could provide a broad framework for how best to move forward.
In terms of moving forward, from what you've seen so far, how would you like to see education move forward?
Well, I think, we're going to see some school reopening. I think there has to be a hybrid model. I don't think Ontario is off base with what they're proposing. Similarly, I'm not suggesting that we need to do the same in Saskatchewan or Manitoba. So I think the notion that schools are going to open is important. I really do think there needs to be a conversation with teachers who are going to be the equivalent of the frontline workers in the classrooms. And from what I've heard, at least in Saskatchewan, that hasn't happened to the level I think it should. I think we're going to have to be prepared for clusters and hotspots to occur and have plans in those cases to come up with a remote alternative. I think we also need to recognize, as much as there is some chatter that seems to be coming across that, students' health is in peril if schools don't reopen, the alternative of reopening too soon is going to put teachers, their families, students, and their families in jeopardy. So I think we really need a thoughtful, measured approach as we go to reopening.
Jerome Cranston is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina as we talk about students going back to school in September in the pandemic. And you know, we talk about education and you know, what this pan-Canadian approach would look like. But, you know, provinces, and we saw this with long-term care, they don't like federal meddling.
No, I absolutely agree. So I recognize that. You're absolutely correct. In fact, you know, the way that schooling in Canada is constructed according to the Constitution is provinces have the authority. So it's not like anyone's doing anything incorrectly now. I just think that if we were to follow a very similar model that's come out of Health Canada, and again, provinces have provincial mandate on healthcare, I think there's at least a general framework where we could have informed discussions, which then could be used on the more detailed plans that provinces develop. So you're absolutely right, Ed. At provincial level in education, nobody wants federal meddling either. But I do think we've seen a real bright spot in terms of public health and coming out of Teresa Tam's office that can, paint a picture for how we might be able to move forward.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to students returning to class in September?
I think one of the things that I haven't heard a lot about is the actual, what we refer to as the physical built environment of school. So not dismissing the significance that COVID-19 as a virus is going to create, you know, what those physical environments are going to look like and the impact they have on learning. We know that everything from classroom setup to desk location to proximity for students to the way that students flow through classrooms actually has an effect on their learning and development. So if they're brought back to school, I think there needs to be more thought to the impact that those physical environments actually have. About a month ago, a number of leading pediatricians out of the province of Quebec penned a letter saying that given the low prevalence of incidents outside, that younger age school children should be allowed to mingle freely on playgrounds. I think we really have to give serious thought to what those physical environments are going to look like when students return back to school.
Jerome, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Ed. Good luck with the rest of the day.
Jerome Cranston is the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. Now, students, for the most part in Canada, have not been in a classroom since March, and there will be a lot of adapting to do. Carol Campbell is Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. And Carol joins us now. And let's talk about students missing school since March. What kind of an impact does this have on their ability to learn and on their well-being?
Ed, we don't fully know the outcomes from what's happened. Obviously, we have never seen something like this where students were out of school for a prolonged period, unexpectedly. Around the world, 1.6 billion students were out of school. So what we know from previous research, for example, over the summer break, is that when students are not in school, sometimes their learning does not progress as much as we would want or hope, particularly students that are struggling. However, these students were not on summer break. They were still receiving remote learning, so teaching and learning was still happening. So for some students, they actually have enjoyed being home. They're calmer, they're happier. But of course, on the other extreme, there are students for whom this has been extremely serious. They're disconnected, disadvantaged, falling back in their learning, and in some severe cases, there have been issues of health and abuse and trauma. So we're going to see students with a wide range of experiences when they return to the next school year.
How will you know, or an educator, a teacher will know if a student, when we go back in September, is struggling with their learning or their well-being?
Yeah, so that's so at the start of the school year, part of the process is to use assessment within your classroom through homework, sometimes through diagnostic assessments, to have a sense of where a student is in terms of their learning, where they're struggling, what support they need. So that's something that teachers are trained to do. That's going to be especially important this year to see where students have progressed or not over the past, what will end up being 6 months since the pandemic began.
Now, let's talk about online learning. How would you characterize the online learning in Ontario to finish out the year?
So Ontario moved, like many provinces, to emergency response remote learning. So online learning, to really do online learning well, it's something that you need to plan over time. So your way of teaching online is different. It's not as straightforward as you do a Zoom video and you just post the same resources. So I teach online, it's something that needs planning. So I do want to give credit to teachers because they had to turn around in a couple of days and move to online. But what we do know is that we do not have universal access to internet in Ontario. Not every student has a personal device. Not every student has someplace quiet to study when they're not in school. So if online learning is part of the future scenario, we really need investment in making sure that every student and indeed every teacher has high quality online learning resources to support them.
It's always been a big issue in Ontario. Rural areas have such terrible or spotty access to Wi-Fi, and meanwhile in the cities they would have it as well. But there's obviously a number of people who would be on the outside looking in. Now, you've written a list of 10 things for policymakers to consider for reopening, and you mentioned looking at where it was done successfully. Where would you look to?
So Denmark was one of the very first countries in Europe, but also in the world, to reopen. And they have largely been successful. By the start of June, over 20 countries had reopened. So it's not just Denmark. Now we have several countries that you could look at to be successful. And there are some common themes when you look across those countries.
And the common themes are?
Yeah. So the first piece is, the first priority is to get the rate of infection of COVID-19 down in the community. So for Canada, that's important. The summer is crucial because if there's community spread, when schools reopen, the spread goes into schools and vice versa. So the first thing is you have to get the infection under control as much as possible. Second is phased reopening. So in Denmark, they started with some year groups first and then gradually built up. BC has done the same successfully here in Canada. So it's not everybody back to school on the first day of school. I mean, that has implications. The other piece is staggered start times to the school day because there's going to need to be more buses. There's not going to be encouragement of students to walk or to cycle if that's safe and if they're able to, so that you can control how many people arrive at school at the same time. Then within school, there has to be public health, full compliance, so that's physical distancing. In some countries, masks are being used, but less students in a classroom. Our classrooms are not sufficiently big for a 2-meter square around a student. So that means you need to find more space for more classrooms, whether that's repurposing of space in schools if it's available, community space, and also use of outdoor learning where that's a possibility because outdoor things are easier. Obviously, public health protocols, hand washing, cleaning, what to do when somebody has symptoms or somebody is diagnosed as positive, and then the supports around schools so that there is a availability of childcare, and as I've mentioned earlier, there's availability of online learning.
Carol Campbell is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And you brought up a point that is something I haven't heard too much about in this whole thing about returning to school, and that's busing. I've heard very little about an approach to busing. It seems like obviously you're going to have students spread out, but has there been an approach to this yet?
Yeah, so here in Ontario, our ministry has put out some guidelines around busing. So basically, as long as physical distancing is required, there can be less students in a bus. And obviously, the driver has to have PPE. That has huge implications. I mean, I live in Toronto, but in rural areas too. We're going to need more buses, or we're going to need to move to staggered entry into school so that buses can be rotating, but then you have cleaning implications. So transport is a big issue. Like you, I worry that it's certainly not been part of the public messaging from our government, and there's not funding being provided around these implications. But children have to leave school and arrive at school healthy, and of course they're going back and forward to homes and to communities, so we have to minimize any transmission of infection.
We mentioned Ontario's offering that hybrid of in-class and online learning, and many medical professionals, including Ottawa's Medical Officer of Health, is pushing for 5 days in class. Which offers the best opportunity for students?
Well, the ideal is 5 days in class. I mean, we of course want high quality teaching and learning for our students. We've already talked about inequities for disadvantage. So we want to support students not only with their learning, but address any mental health issues and their well-being. But that only works if it's safe. So we have to make sure that it's done safely. And that will mean significant changes within our schools to comply with public health. Our schools, many schools don't have individual student desks. Students work round tables, they rotate round learning spaces. Not all of our schools have sufficient sinks for hand washing. So while the ideal is to get everybody back into school, and some education systems are doing that now, I don't want to underestimate that we can only do that in a way that's safe, and that requires investment to make it safe in schools.
Carol, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Pat.
Carol Campbell's Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Now, all the changes on the horizon for school and school boards are going to add to the education price tag. Marit Stiles is the opposition education critic and the MPP for Davenport, and she joins us now. And Marit, why are you not a fan of the plan to return to school in September?
Well, actually, my concern has been that the government, and particularly the Minister of Education, have been so unclear and have also been sort of changing their expectations with boards for months now. My concern is that there doesn't seem to be a clear plan coming from the province, and also that any of the things that they're demanding of boards are going to cost money. They're going to mean additional resources and support, more staff. And so far, the government has yet to really put up any additional resources and commit that. And so I'm concerned that without those resources, any plan to bring students back in the fall will either fail or maybe not safe enough for our kids.
Now, you've tabled an emergency action plan to return to class in September. What is the plan?
Right. So, among other things, and these are all have come from many months now of consultation with parents and students and experts, the educators like Dr. Campbell. So things like putting together an advisory group that actually represents some of the frontline workers as well as parents and students. And of course, education experts. This is something the government has failed very dramatically to do. Resources, including additional funding to cover what additional staff will be needed if we're going to have smaller, and what we ultimately want is more smaller classes, right? But I've also said, we need to protect parents. We need to make sure that staff are protected. And so to do that, we need to make sure that there is paid sick leave for families so that they don't have to worry that if their kid is sick one day or not feeling well, they can afford to keep them home and stay home from work if they need to. And there needs to be an investment in childcare. So far, the government's kind of said, hey, childcare centers, go ahead, open up. But what we know increasingly is that there will not be enough childcare spaces available for families coming into the fall, and certainly not if there's some sort of rotating, modified model of going back to school.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions sort of hovering over families through this summer is, what happens if we have the hybrid they talk about, 2 days in school learning, 2 days at home, and And then who stays home with the kids? Is there any childcare? There's a lot of like open-ended questions here.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I would say, honestly, in the last few weeks, I think we've really seen a lot of families, we got through that terrible period, right? We figured it out. Some people were still frustrated with the way that this kind of emergency remote learning worked. And a lot of people lost their jobs. We know that. But then all of a sudden the realization hit, oh my goodness, this could be continuing like this in the fall. And it might even be a more bizarre format where you have one of your children going to school one day and another child going the next day. How do working families manage that? And so I'm hearing from a lot of people, particularly women, I have to say, who are finding themselves in a position of having to choose between their jobs, if they're lucky enough to still have one, and supervising their children. And, really that's no choice at all. And it will damage our chances of economic recovery.
Marit Stiles is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. She is the opposition education critic and the MPP for Davenport as we talk about students returning to school in September. Now, the education minister didn't feel there was enough uptake of the video conference learning at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, it was part of the problem, rural broadband, because we do know in Ontario, rural broadband is at best bad.
Oh my goodness, yes. And, we've heard so many times, so many promises from this government already in the last 2 yehave a radical expansion of broadband. We have not seen that happen. A lot of our MPPs, NDP MPPs in the north have been calling for this. I think any plan to return to school has to address that as well. But look, this whole issue of having us have these, what the minister calls it synchronous learning. In other words, basically live time online with your teacher. And that is, that's one thing that some teachers have made work. But the problem is it doesn't work for every family or for every teacher. And so teachers know this, right? They'll know, which families are juggling terrible broadband, or maybe they only have one device that every kid in the household is sharing for school. So sometimes it just doesn't work. And I think we need to appreciate to some extent, certainly the professional judgment of our teachers, who know their classrooms and know what's working. And some tools will not work for every classroom.
Do you feel students need to be in class 5 days a week?
I think the ideal would be that we could get to that place in a safe way. But I think that will absolutely, no question, require a significant investment in personal protective equipment and infection control in our schools. It also means we have to have these smaller class sizes, which means we have to do that. We have to almost double up our number of teachers. We have to vastly increase the number of staff and supports, and we have to find additional space in some cases. Some school boards are talking about, mothballed classrooms that, maybe they'll be reopening now. Not every area of the province has that luxury. So, and the other big issue for a lot of boards is busing. Busing is a massive cost to boards. It has been not addressed by governments, liberal or conservative, in many years, not adequately. And a lot of the boards are really not sure how they're going to get kids to class at all. So there are many big hurdles, but what's really missing here is the provincial government coming forward with a commitment to providing the resources so we could get as many of our kids back to school as possible in a safe and healthy way.
What would you like to see in Ontario's plan that's not there now?
Well, for sure, I would like to see a financial commitment from the government to more space. I really do also feel that even though the government keeps saying they've added money for mental health, that there's really no new dollars there. And I think we're going to have to, get real here. Young people, whether you're in kindergarten or you're in grade 9, it's been a really rough time. And there are going to be a lot of challenges for a lot of students, including a lot of, trauma actually come from this. So we need to make sure they're supported. We need to make sure our staff are supported. And to be honest, like when people keep saying to me, well, that's going to cost a lot. And I say, but what more important investment could there be? It's not just about, obviously it's about our children, which is important. It's also about our economy. Again, we cannot restart this economy unless we have childcare and schools up and running. And we can't do that. We can't expect families to send their children back or teachers to go to work if they don't believe their kids are going to be safe.
Marit, I want to thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Marit Stiles is the NDP opposition education critic and MPP of Davenport. And this leads to our unpublished .vote question. Do you feel comfortable seeing students back in school in September? Yes, no, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now to have your say. I want to thank Jerome Cranston, Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina, Carol Campbell, Associate Professor, Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T, and Marit Stiles, the NDP opposition critic and MPP for Davenport. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.